And I think what's beautiful about where we're at is that not only are we working with utilities, we're building and enabling that capability in the vehicles with a lot of our partners like Tesla and Toyota and Stellantis and others, where they actually have now vehicles that are much more grid aware and grid intelligent, which is to say that just because your car has a plug doesn't mean it's actually valuable to the grid. And so how do you make the car valuable to the grid? You have to build a bunch of smarts in there. And that's a lot of what we do with our partners.
Welcome to Climate Papa. This is a show about climate change, technology, and parenthood.
All right, well, welcome to Climate Papa, a show about the intersection of climate change, parenthood, and technology. And I'm your host, Ben Eidelson. I'm based in Seattle with my wife and 3 kids, a 7-year-old girl, a 4-year-old boy, and now a 1-year-old little boy. In my day job, I'm an investor in climate tech startups with my fund, Step Change Ventures. Now, when you zoom out from the day-to-day madness in the US, and there's a lot of it, you realize that despite what's going on, 2 of our biggest sources of emissions, transportation and electricity, are being smashed together as consumers flock to electric vehicles. It's one of the most exciting and important shifts that's ongoing in the climate transition. But there's a massive hidden challenge that we don't talk about nearly enough. Our electrical grid, the system of poles, wires, and transformers that power our lives, was never designed to suddenly handle millions of cars plugging in at the same time. And if we get it wrong, we risk overloading the system, driving up energy costs and slowing down the whole transition. But if we get it right, we can turn those millions of EVs into a massive flexible resource that actually helps make the grid cleaner, cheaper, and more resilient. This is one of the biggest system challenges in the entire energy transition. And it's the exact problem that my guest today, Apoorv, has spent the better part of a decade working to solve. Apoorv is the co-founder and CEO of WeaveGrid, a company building the critical software layer to help utilities, automakers, and drivers work together to orchestrate this massive change. And in our conversation, we go deep on why the real bottleneck for EV adoption isn't what you think it is. And we bust some of the common myths about EV charging and talk about what it really takes to build the digital infrastructure for this new clean economy. Apoorv also shares his personal journey from seeing resource scarcity firsthand as a kid to the realities of being a founder trying to change a massive, slow-moving industry. All right, with that, welcome on, Apoorv.
Hi, I'm Apoorv, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of WeaveGrid, and I'm based in San Francisco.
Thank you, Apoorv, for coming on. I know we've been Twitter or X or whatever we want to call it, climate buddies for a while, but this is probably the longest conversation we've had the chance to have. So excited to learn more about you, about your journey, about what you're working on at WeaveGrid, about the things all around that. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Ben. I'm really excited to be here.
Before we get into the world of your work and how you arrived at that, what else is going on in your life? And what else is good context for people to have about Apoorv the human?
Oh, as a human right now, I feel like I have a very full class. I came off of a pretty long travel spree. That was a lot. It was almost 5 weeks of back-to-back travel, so not short, including everything from international travel to flying across the country. And then just been trying to figure out my life along with running the company. Feeling very fortunate to be in just like a great place from a company is working, it's moving, things are rolling, not feeling as distracted by the ups and downs of the political stuff happening. I'm feeling very focused in that way, but I feel like I have a very full glass right now. And sometimes people are like, oh, what are your hobbies? And I'm like, I don't know if I have time for hobbies, guys. I don't do hobbies right now.
When you say figure out your life, what does that mean? What feels not figured out?
You're pulling on that thread, huh?
You left a frayed thread out blowing in the wind, and I'm like, ugh, like what?
Yeah. Well, it's the joys of spending the last 7 years of my life building and growing and throwing all my energy into it. And so I think at some point last year, I told myself that in order to have another 7 years, in order to really make this a sustainable, long-term investment. I needed to both focus on my own health. I needed to make sure I've always taken sleep seriously, but I wanted to focus on my health. I wanted to focus on other aspects of my life, like dating and all of that fun stuff that comes with being in your early 30s. I guess I should stop saying early 30s. I'm now 35, but mid 30s. And, just like investing in the other things that also enable you to keep going from work, because when those things are going well, then you can reinvest that energy back into work. And when work is going well, you can reinvest that back into your life. And if you're not living a fulfilling life, then work can be as fulfilling or as absorbing as you want, and it doesn't even matter. I don't love the term work-life balance. I just don't think that exists for founders. I think it's a silly phrase for founders. There is no balance. You're thinking about it when you're in the shower. You're thinking about it when you're outside in nature. You're thinking about it when you're buying an ice cream. You're always thinking about it. The question is, how do you get those other forms of energy, of life satisfaction, such that you don't feel drained by it at all times? So that's what's going on.
Do you feel like you've been explicitly putting everything out of sight, out of mind, like for the last 7 years of full on focus? Or do you feel like it's more like your natural state of being to just be all consumed by the thing? And it's actually the opposite. And now you're like, no, I need to explicitly force myself to defocus a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I don't think it's been that I've always been all consumed or anything. I'm sure this will tie back to like my journey in climate and the journey with WeaveGrid. But the part of it is that it's a hard space to build in. And it's a space where, especially when you're category creating, the words product market fit can mean very different things. We absolutely have product market fit. But like, there's no utility or no automaker that you could talk to today who would say, no, we don't get the point of this. It's just that making the market want the product at the scale that satisfies venture investors and can keep fulfilling you as a fast growing company and so on and so forth. Like, that stuff takes time and a lot of work and a lot of like creating the market. It's not as simple as saying, hey, you're building new CRM software. Let's just go displace the old CRM software. It's not the same. And I find that work, whether it's educating investors, educating policymakers, frankly, sometimes uneducating some people so that you can re-educate them about the way the reality works. All of that takes a lot of time and effort. And ultimately, I just love what we do. I think it's so important. And so when you're passionate about it, when you really feel like the reason you're doing it is not because you just wanted to start a company, but because this was the thing you felt like your whole life was leading towards, it's hard to then pull back in those moments where you feel like you're really pushing the industry and the world forward. And then, of course, the sacrifice is that you don't make time for yourself. So I don't think I'm defocusing. It's more just that I'm realizing that in order for me to focus on work, I need to focus on myself. Well, this got a lot deeper than I expected.
I don't subscribe to the idea that you can isolate in a black box what someone's doing with their like analytical, intellectual abilities and work, and especially as a founder, sit absent everything else around it. And I just think that people are whole people. I think it's a really real thing to tie your fate to a new company and then grow that into a slightly bigger company and then a bigger one and a bigger one. And it's both magic and hard. And it's hard when it goes poorly, and it's hard when it goes really well. And so I just think it's a real thing worth being open about.
Absolutely. I also think that I was very fortunate to be warned by many talented founders that like this is an all-consuming thing emotionally. I think that's what it is. It's not time, it's emotion.
Right.
I think the thing that I never really hit me was just like, as much as you can tell yourself, and I used to have a little mantra, like, I'm not my company is not me. As much as you can have that mantra to yourself, like the emotional hits up and down do make yourself go up and down with it. Like, it doesn't, especially because you're riding the roller coaster at the scariest part of the roller coaster. And so as the founder and CEO, you feel those ups and downs really the hardest. And often you're trying to manage your own emotions so that you're not presenting all of those to everyone else. But also because you're the first one to feel it, it doesn't matter what you do. You go up and down with what's happening. I feel like that has been a journey and a maturation that I've gone through over the last 6 to 7 years, where it's really been about, and I'm somebody who wears my emotion on my sleeve. So I also don't like bullshitting people that I'm not feeling a certain way. I'm very honest about how I feel. But how you manage that is been a whole new set of lessons for me. And yeah, I both love it. And I'm also like, wow, this was not what I thought life would be.
Yeah. We'll get into how it's going, but I think it's going pretty well from what I've gathered. And so I think it's good to share that in this context of it can be hard even when it's going well. I don't know, it going well, I think is the permission for it to continue to be hard.
Oh, for sure. There's always those moments I give myself the grace for where I'm take a big step back, just go chill out somewhere and look back and just say, what have we accomplished? It's pretty significant. And unfortunately, the way that the things we've accomplished get measured will not be in a website telling you how many tons of CO2 we've removed because of the number of pounds of whatever we've buried underground. It won't be in the number of avoided emissions this day and that day. It's hard to quantify sometimes when you're dealing with system solutions like ours. The system is getting better, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and you can start to see that and feel that, and just our performance indicators show that. And I think that's the biggest success that you can feel. But then you also hear it in the words that partners and customers and industry think boys and policymakers are saying, and you're like, wow, those were my words. And somehow
they're echoing around the room.
They're echoing around the room. So it's a good feeling. You do really feel a great sense of pride and joy, and I think importantly, fulfillment in the work that we've been able to push the world forward. That's
awesome.
Maybe that's the deepest I'm going to get today.
Okay. We'll see. You never know.
We'll see. You never know.
All right, let's get into it. So why don't you share a little bit about kind of your journey to WeaveGrid, and then, what WeaveGrid is and kind of where you're at?
Yeah. I'm going to go all the way back here.
All the way back.
You offered that to me in the prep session. So I'm going to go all the way back. In the beginning, the thing I'm fortunate to have had was a childhood that was situated all over the world. So I was born in India, but grew up most of my life on the tiny Mediterranean island of Cyprus. And growing up in Cyprus, it was a fascinating look into what the future could be like in some sense, and not necessarily in the best of ways. It's a beautiful island. Yes, it's got all this great beaches and all that. Brilliant place to live. But in the mid-90s, we went through these crazy droughts where we just totally ran out of water. For context, the average taxi in Cyprus is a Mercedes S-Class. So it's an extremely nice place to live. But when you run out of water, it's an extremely difficult place to live. And running out of water in that kind of society meant you're literally talking about getting running water 2 days a week, 3 days a week. So you can very quickly start to see when you start to go from a world of abundance to shortage, things can get pretty gnarly. Then I would go back to visit family in India all the time. And I think one of the things that has always drawn me much more to the energy transition and climate and this broader space is that when you really see people who do not have, it really starts to limit the scope of stuff you care about when you live in a world of haves. And what I mean by that is I hear so many debates about, should we do this thing with this distributed energy resource? Should we do that thing? Should we do this? Should we do that? And I just come back to the fact that the country I was born in, there are still people, and there definitely were growing up, a lot of people, much less so today, but there were a lot of people who didn't have power for 8 to 9 hours a day. The quality of life difference isn't one of, I have to buy a backup generator. It was, you don't have access to education. You don't have access to healthcare. You don't have access to running and clean water. That's the difference in a quality of life. Yeah. And so when I hear micro debates about how we're going to do this thing and how we're going to do that thing, that is really a 10% incremental value of life improvement, it just kind of annoys me because I'm oh my God, the climate challenge is so much bigger when you think about the need for development and the need for removing energy poverty. And then this is one of my favorite phrases, but climate is a systems challenge. And so my sort of coming of age in climate, as it were, was maybe not too dissimilarly from Greta around the age of 13. But when I was 13, the Iraq War broke out, and Cyprus being situated where it is, the Royal Air Force had their forward operating bases for the Middle East in Cyprus. And so they'd be launching sorties into Iraq to go bomb Baghdad, etc. And I think being so closely situated to something that was so geopolitically present in our lives in a day-to-day kind of way, and also something that was so intrinsically linked to oil and energy, it got me thinking about this space of what are we doing? Why is this happening? What exactly is energy? And then, of course, like you take these moments of like shortage, you take the moments of seeing a lack of development, you take these moments of geopolitics, bring it all together, and you're like, wait a second, now here's this whole new risk multiplier also called climate change. Speaking about getting deep again, I've also been an immigrant my whole life. So that's the other fun thing. It's like you kind of realize, oh, if like geopolitics meets high heat waves and rising tides and this and that leads to people moving across these so-called lines called countries' borders, and now you have more and more immigration, like that gets pretty scary very, very quickly. Because even as a very fortunate immigrant, I definitely did not feel always like I was welcomed in the places I've lived. So I think all of that got me thinking at a pretty young age that apparently the adults seem to be missing the plot here, that there's this huge challenge called climate change. We just got to go work on it. Of course, I had my inconvenient truth moment and all that fun stuff. But I think that just drew me in. And I was like, all right, this is the thing I got to go work on. And I have no idea how I'm going to solve it, but I just want to go work on it. And that was it. Never really looked back since then. And I think it's been nice to have a single track mind. I mean, there are so many moments where I like look at the state of healthcare, education, and other things. And I'm like, God, I wish people fixed it. But I like cannot pull myself away from wanting to work on climate and energy. And that's just been my journey.
You're now in a world where you have customers as motivators and a particular part of the puzzle that you're in.
Totally.
But to what extent over the last 7 years do you find yourself getting motivation from the macro and from that early experiences, or do you find you don't really need to go there and so it's just like a backdrop for you?
I think it remains an integral part of my story and who I am. And I think it remains very like fulfilling to think that so many years on, I continue to be focused on those topics. But, you know, look, the macro, especially in today's day and age, I feel like it's just so present. And I think we're also like so much more exposed to the news cycle in a day-to-day way. There's constantly stuff going on. So I actually feel like the macro is more present in some ways in my life. And I actually almost have to make an effort to like zoom back in and focus on the company more than allowing myself to get distracted by what's going on day to day.
You don't need that to yank
exactly.
you away.
But that said, I think the macro is really important also because if you don't think about it, you do get too distracted by the like ups and downs of this customer and that thing and this integration and that API and this person and their needs and only that. And you forget that like, for me, ultimately what gives me energy is the ability to keep doing this work and keep seeing the impact we're having. And so I guess I drift between the macro and the micro. That's me.
Yeah, that's useful. Okay, so from childhood through to car APIs, like what rocks do we need to skip on?
Yeah. I guess my point again is like I've always kind of understood climate to be a systems problem. And I have always been drawn to thinking about problems in the systems that they live in, right? And so I found myself coming to the US for college. And at that point, my theory of change of how I was going to go fix some of these things. And again, let me be very clear. Like I was super naive. I don't think I alone can ever fix anything. But I very much believed that there was a way I could actuate some sort of change. So my theory of change back then was I was going to go figure out how to invent a new battery or something and save the world that way. The South Park meme, step 1, step 2, question mark, step 3, profit. That was basically it. What I ended up happening was when I landed up at Rice for undergrad, I was super interested in the energy transition because it was the kind of height of clean tech 1.0. There was so much going on there, a lot, especially around materials innovation. But I was also in Houston, so there was a lot happening when it comes to natural gas and the shale revolution.
Yep.
Felt myself very drawn to both chemical engineering and also economics, and that's what I did. And again, I really thought I was going to go get a PhD and figure it out that way. Coming to the end of my time, I just realized shoving me in a lab for 6 years was not going to be
your jam. Yep.
It's not going to be my jam. And I decided right before I left undergrad, which I absolutely loved what I worked on, but I decided I really needed to think of a different way to have that scalable impact. And the thing that made the most sense was I looked around and I said, businesses seem to know how to scale things. That seems to be the one institutional construct that has scaled things effectively. Again, naive 21-year-old, right? That's just what I had. So I applied to business school without knowing anything about it. And I got in, and the way it worked was Stanford said, hey, go get a job and come back in a few years when you're ready. And I said, okay, I will go do that. But it was really nice to know that I was going. And so super fortunate as I was, I won't go through my LinkedIn, but basically started off in this other field I knew nothing about called management consulting, where I learned a ton about working with energy companies and utilities. That's what they did. They said, hey, looking at your background, we're only going to put you in energy, which was great. And the lessons learned from that particularly were around how corporations make decisions or often don't make decisions.
Yep.
And also how much of our infrastructure runs through big companies that have, I think, the incentive to do the right thing, but also have very little incentive to change.
Right.
And balancing that was a really tough place for them, right? And so what that led me to was eventually joining a company called Opower, where I spent a few years in DC, and I loved it. It was just such a great experience of learning how to build software and products that could help with energy efficiency, what's known as demand response, really fixating on scalable solutions in the clean energy climate space. Opower was one of the very few companies that did really well in the first wave of clean tech. And I think what I learned there especially was just what does a go-to-market motion in a complex systems-oriented solution look like? And how do you go about effectuating policy change, but also then selling your solution and then scaling your solution? And how do you then build products and services that really work for that customer set? Amazing.
I mean, I think they're probably one of the few companies of that era that like cracked selling software to a utility, which echoes through to today and requires a special team that understands the needs of utilities, how they make decisions, how they work, and all these things that matter if you're going to affect the big system.
I agree. And fast forwarding from there, I landed up in grad school, got my MS and my MBA at Stanford. I think we share that alma mater. I think one of the things that often surprises me when I talk to investors, when I talk to people who are in climate and so on, is they say things like, utilities are really hard. I think what actually gobsmacks me when I hear that is I'm like, what isn't hard?
Right.
What climate solution did you think you were going to sell in an easier way? Did you think that Mittal Steel is going to buy your clean steel solution faster than a utility? Did you think that United's going to buy your SAF thing faster than a utility? What large incumbent isn't hard? And that always blows my mind.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you. And I actually have seen a big wave that I kind of consider myself and a part of, which is like fintech to climate folks who are not that afraid of it. Because you know what? Like banks and utilities have a lot of parallels. It's a heavily regulated industry, incumbent legacy systems, but are still working in the realm of human-made systems, right? Like utilities are not a natural occurrence. It's not pure commodities. It's like, no, you actually have to build infrastructure and do things. And banks are ultimately ways of pushing paper around and databases, but they're huge. And there's a lot of committees and a lot of systems and a lot of rules and a lot of risk mitigation and blah, 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 blah. And if you want to have scale, if Stripe wants to have scale, it needs banking partners. That's what it does. That is the product.
Agree.
It is a layer to the banking system.
Fintech people are my favorite people to talk to in tech because they totally get it. They understand what it's like to both build products that can scale super fast in a way that consumers find delightful, but also how much you have to leverage legacy infrastructure to make that work. And I totally agree. It also helps that both my parents worked in fintech for their whole career, so maybe that's why.
You grew up in a fintech household.
I did, yeah. Super nerdy. My dad eventually retired as a pretty senior product guy at MasterCard, so I've only ever heard that conversation at the dinner table, which is why I never thought I would be in fintech, and here we are in climate-ish tech that has
fintech, yeah.
But I have a great admiration for fintech for that reason.
Yeah. Okay, so post-business school, you're just ready to go? You saw the problem and you're just like, this is it? Was this like a business school case study?
I did not even think I wanted to start a company. I think coming into business school, I was very much not one of my peers in B school who was like, yep, company, Stanford, startup, that's my thing. Yep. I was sort of like, yeah, look, I've worked at an earlier stage company. I found it really fun. I want to see if I can try and figure out other ways to scale my impact. And I think maybe it's also the experience of going to Stanford GSB, but you just get warned so many times by people who are grizzled and are like, it's really hard. don't start a company unless you're ready to do the hard thing. And I'm like, okay, yeah. That's not how you did it.
It normalizes it, right? It's like if you happen to like move somewhere for 2 years and everyone around you climbed Mount Everest, then it just seems like it's normal to climb Mount Everest. And it's not normal. But
it's not normal.
But it becomes normal.
Totally.
That's Stanford and startups.
It really is. There's so many amazing places. I think we're fortunate enough to have seen it at Stanford, but other places too that I think do something really fundamental to your brain, which is that they make you rethink the concept of risk. And I think what I mean by that is, by the time I was hitting the end of my joint degree, I was really asking myself the question, I'm 27, I think at the time, 27, 28, whatever. And I have so much privilege in the fact that I have seen some amazing companies. I have this incredible set of degrees and so on. And you know what I really have is insane amounts of energy to go keep working on a space and luckily have enough knowledge about how the space works between different experiences that I just feel like I should go do that. Yeah. And I remember talking to one of my mentors and she was just kind of like, look, you're not going to find a job that's going to allow you to stretch yourself in all of those ways. And I was like, no. But come on. I'm sure there's a company that wants to hire me because of all these skills. And she was like, there's many companies that will want to hire you. I just don't think you're going to get excited by the work that any of them are doing. As I was thinking through the different problems that mattered, I was looking basically at the emissions chart, right? Yeah. And the two leading forms of emissions in the United States at least, are transportation and energy. We could spend hours talking about all the things I did at Stanford that got me interested in those two things and the intersection that led to WeaveGrid. But I will say that just starting top down, I was like, transportation is number one, energy is number two, electricity is number two. Okay, what are we going to do to solve this problem? Now, it just so happened that I started thinking about how do we scale up the adoption of EVs? And I was talking to a person who has now remained a lifelong mentor. And he at the time ran a fund called Generate Capital. This is Jigar Shah. And I was chatting with Jigar and I was like, look, I think there's a way we can lease EVs like you did with Sun Edison. Maybe we can find a way to accelerate EVs through that. But the way to make it all work is if we do something valuable with the EVs and turn them into a grid resource. And he was like, that sounds like a great idea. You should go do that. And I was like, no. I don't really want to be in the financial services business, especially leasing cars. And yeah, I got very fortunate. We got one of those YC calls and got to an interview with them. And I was just like, the economics suck here. What am I doing? This doesn't make any sense. This was as I was graduating. I graduated and I was terrified. I didn't have a job. The startup thing that I was tinkering with didn't make any sense. I'm an immigrant, so I had a year clock to figure out my next job. And that was basically it. I had a few interviews. I'm sure I could have gotten a job or two, but I just wouldn't have been happy. I wouldn't have been satisfied. None of those things really called to me. And so there was this problem though, as I thought about, okay, as we keep scaling the adoption of EVs, let's say that leasing business worked and we could have scaled the crap out of EVs. As I thought about the system and the end-to-end system, it was so clear to me that the grid was going to become the bottleneck. Yeah. Again, I love smashing memes because I feel like I see so many memes in our sector. And if you just let people talk on the conference circuit, something I hate doing, they'll just keep talking about these memes. But the meme is that charging infrastructure is the reason EVs haven't taken off. My hypothesis is actually that most of the challenge is that we haven't built good, functional, high quality charging infrastructure that would alleviate most people's perception that charging is the bottleneck. The real bottleneck to EV adoption is the grid. But the problem is the grid, whether it be in fast charging infrastructure or the grid, whether it be in home charging, the grid is not thought about as a part of your end-to-end supply chain. Yeah. So most people who overfixate on charging because they're like gas stations, it must be the same like EVs. And it's not. 80% of your charging happens at home. 60% of Americans live in single family homes. Even with multi and single family housing, you're gonna find 80 to 90% of charging in the long term happening at home. And that's the crazy thing. So that really means that you're looking at a very short tail of charging that needs to happen in public charging infrastructure. And we have spent billions of dollars pumping money into companies and entities, some of them aren't even companies, trying to prop up public charging. And it doesn't really quite make sense because you need it to run basically like infrastructure. As I looked at it, I was like, hold on, the grid infrastructure thing, who's looking at that? Yeah. And in my early conversations, it was so clear that utilities were just not thinking. They were thinking very linearly, which makes total sense.
We ended up investing in one company in this space. It's electric, which has the shared thesis.
Love those guys. Yeah.
You need more chargers out where people live. Simple, like available chargers. This is so obvious, but like I think about the joules in the gas that are getting piped into the gas station in order to fill up your tank. And instead of that, it's going to go through the wires to people's houses into the cars, right? And like,
exactly.
You're fundamentally shifting the delivery of energy that's going to ultimately then be used for transportation. And once that hit me, I'm like, oh, all the money then that we spend at gas stations is going to also move ultimately in one form or another to buy energy in this other way. And then to your point, like the grid is absolutely the mechanism of delivery for all of that. It is obviously the pipes. You've been saying it a lot longer, but like it seems blindingly obvious once you think of it that way.
I think the problem is, and this goes back to, again, memes, but like, I think the meme is we're just going to fill up our cars at gas stations. We just need a ton of superchargers. And if you talk to the Tesla team, they will also tell you that's not true. Even the folks at Tesla who are way ahead of everyone else on this, fast charging in this country is necessary, but not sufficient.
Relieve people's range anxiety for the exceptional travel.
Exactly.
Which is a very different thing.
Right. Very different thing. So anyway, how do we get started at WeaveGrid? So my co-founder, John, who did come from Tesla, him and I met at grad school. And I think the thesis we both had was that now you're talking about taking 32% of emissions called transportation and another, at that point it was 30% of emissions called electricity, and bringing them together at breakneck speed. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is these are two very independent systems that haven't historically ever talked to one another. And now they're going to become one integrative system with electrification. And what I mean by that is you're now going to have a grid that's going to become more and more reliant on electrification to do the right things. Or if it does the wrong things, it's going to become a very expensive grid. And vice versa. If EVs need to take off, you need an electric grid that is cheap and reliable and affordable and clean. And so this codependency became so apparent to us. But the codependency isn't just one of hardware. It's also one that requires a digital infrastructure layer. And that's really where we just saw a huge gap. And the gap was there because basically when you look at the history of load flexibility, demand response, consumer devices participating in energy, it's all really a game of trying to solve what are called the 5 to 6 peaks a year, where you need to fire up a bunch of natural gas power plants. And I think the problem is that everything we have done has been so fixated on those 5 to 6 events a year that we've really struggled to think about the rest of the infrastructure below that power plant. And so what you needed was a completely different approach to what we call bottoms-up load flexibility, where you needed to think first actually about the delivery system, aka the distribution system. But when I say delivery in electricity, 90% of times people are like, oh my God, transmission, you're right, we need to build more. And I'm like, yet another meme. Okay, we do need to build more transmission, guys, but that's not going to be solved entirely by software. It's not going to be solved entirely by also hardware. It's going to be solved by property rights and tort reform. And I'm sorry to say, that's what you need to go figure out.
Yep.
So what we decided was, we said, what if we actually turn the vehicles into an edge level visibility and also an edge level flexibility solution where we could help utilities understand what's happening with electrification, go from understanding and awareness to predictability of what's happening with electrification. And then rather than just stopping at predictability, actually give them the controllability and the management of it such that we can help keep the sort of explosion, as it were, of growth on the grid to as small as possible, such that they can manage it. And even more excitingly, they can then orchestrate that charging with the abundance of renewable energy that's showing up on the grid.
Yep.
Doing all of that, some people call it virtual power plants. I tend to not love that term, but there's a lot of really amazing things you can do with that kind of aggregation of resources and flexibility. And I think the other important thing is it becomes a win, because the way our business works is we sell to utilities. They are our core customer. We distribute our product through utilities to end customers, people like you and I who may drive EVs. And we partner with automakers who also become both a distribution vector, but also are the necessary enablers of data and controls. But that is not as easy as building a software company. And that is another thing that I feel like sometimes people don't understand.
Yeah. You're gluing a bunch of those pieces together, many of which are not used to talking to each other at all Per what you said, when has your local utility ever need to coordinate something with your car before now? Gasoline is the ultimate commodity where no one needs to know which car is filling up because it's just 3 types and put the one in the tank. And this is the opposite, which is like changing the charging behavior of this car at this household actually could make a difference in what we need in this node in the distribution grid. And it's like a 180 from the kind of addressability and detailedness of the entire system, which is a fascinating moment.
It's also a fascinating moment because it's gone from a world where heuristics and humans in the loop could solve almost all of the predictability you needed on the system and all of the construction and the management of that system, right? Like distribution systems in particular really didn't need a ton of software. It didn't need a ton of sensors, didn't need a ton of anything because everything was static and known. People will tell you smart thermostats, dumb thermostats. I don't really care. There was a thermostat either way. The air conditioning unit was like the last time the distribution system really needed to think about change.
Right.
And now electrification is causing that. And what I think is really exciting about that, it now means that when you think about things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, things that can really augment humans, there's so much value, but you have to still be respectful of the human and you have to be really respectful of the fact that all of these things still ride on top of a layer of hardware, whether a car or a distribution transformer that can go anywhere from completely unintelligent, aka a distribution transformer, to hyper intelligent, aka a Tesla. And so how do you then build software that can accommodate all of those different types of hardware and also the person that's trying to manage it all?
Where are we in that journey collectively and maybe specifically from the WeaveGrid vantage point? How much is intelligently connected versus still a lot of big dreams?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the thing that we've done at WeaveGrid, just to now help your listeners understand where we're at, is our software is used by several of the largest utilities around the country today, which is super exciting. Different utilities are in very different places of adoption of EVs. You've got some like Pacific Gas and Electric, where I live in San Francisco, where I think at last count, like we're close to 25% of new sales being EVs. In some counties, it's close to 35%. We've got other customers, like, for example, Alabama Power, who are being super proactive, but definitely don't have that kind of adoption rate of EVs. And the way we think about it is that utilities have an opportunity to go from not just helping people change their behavior in a very static way where, you know, another meme, we were told like, hey, if you just charge at 9 p.m., your car at 9 p.m., everything's going to be fine. That was totally wrong. That was only okay when we were operating in the 0.0001% adoption.
A few early adopters.
Yeah, that was totally fine then. Now the problem is if everyone charges at 9 p.m., you're blowing up your local transformer. Right. So that just doesn't work. And it makes sense, right? Like when you actually look at the metaphors and the analogies of other exponential adoption curves that have happened in history, your cellular bandwidth was very much rate limited back in the day. You know, you remember back in the day, we were told, hey, you can only call people on weekends and nights and you can get it for free or cheap or whatever, free nights and weekends, right? Things like that.
Time of use pricing.
Time of use pricing. Hey, imagine that. Time of use pricing. Guess what? Now I pay AT&T $45 a month and I basically get rate limited between my 4G, my 5G plus, my 5G. And it just happens behind the scenes. I don't even think about it. It just works. All it means is like I have a slightly different bandwidth if I'm trying to stream Netflix while walking around, which you probably shouldn't be doing anyway. But that's the way I think the grid's going to go, which is that ultimately customers shouldn't be holding the hedge and the risk off their management. They should be empowered to save and benefit from that. But it should really be the utilities and vendors like us who are supporting them, partners like us. And I think what's beautiful about where we're at is that not only are we working with utilities, we're building and enabling that capability in the vehicles with a lot of our partners like Tesla and Toyota and Stellantis and others, where they actually have now vehicles that are much more grid aware and grid intelligent, which is to say that just because your car has a plug doesn't mean it's actually valuable to the grid. And so how do you make the car valuable to the grid? You have to build a bunch of smarts in there. And that's a lot of what we do with our partners. I believe you were on a podcast with Dave Roberts recently.
Yes.
A joint podcast. And he has this term, or maybe he's leveraging this term called enshittification. Yes. And I kind of agree with it, which is what I mean by that is I think we have this belief, and I love again that you were in fintech, but we have this belief that if you could just take APIs and you can just build software in an abstraction way, You don't have to think about the underlying infrastructure at all. And I think companies like Stripe honestly did an amazing job in making people believe that was the case. But people like Stripe actually knew the hard work was in going and building those integrations with the infrastructure layer to make it actually all work. We are not at a place in the world in energy where I can abstract away an API from a car and just say, yeah, just tell the car what to do and it's going to happen magically. That's not it. You're still talking about a 2,000-pound vehicle, and how you tell it to operate has huge implications for the customer. It also has huge implications for power quality and power delivery, things that utilities and automakers are not closely enough talking about. And so that's where WeaveGrid sits. It's not just an orchestration platform that is managing cars at a massive scale where when there's too much wind energy in the Midwest, we're moving tons and tons of vehicles to charge at the right time to suck up that extra wind, or that when 10 vehicles are overloading their transformer, we can orchestrate it such that you can basically add 20 more vehicles to that same transformer. We're not just doing that. We're also enabling those car companies to build the capabilities in. We're enabling the utilities to have awareness at that edge and at their operating room level. And we're stitching it all together through software and frankly through a lot of know-how and just building the context for what the world we want to live in looks like. And what I mean is half the time I feel like I'm just educating my partners because they're super smart, but they just don't know what is happening. They just don't know the other half of it. And so that's what we do. And I love that because it allows us to be genuine partners and not just vendors. And I think that shows in frankly the fact that none of our customers want to leave us. And I think that's a great thing.
That's the right way to build a business like this. Well, I think the identification point is actually worth drilling in on, because one lens of that is, what is your level of dependency on a service provider? And so let's do a hypothetical where PG&E is a WeaveGrid customer and I buy a car that's got the max version of WeaveGrid inside and I'm very happy and it's 2025 and I plug it in and I don't know, maybe even some bidirectional stuff next year and I get the new charger and I'm like, I'm living in the future, right? Fast forward 4 years and a PE firm buys you out and shuts it all down. What happens to that customer? How are things designed, or how are you thinking about things being designed in a way that creates resiliency to a cloud service or a particular venture funded startup or what have you? Or how do you think about that?
The first thing I'll say is that at least we take a systems oriented design towards all of these things and work very hand in glove with our partners to say, these are the kinds of things that each of you is going to need. And what I mean by that is we're taking vehicle telemetry at the vehicle level, taking it from the cloud systems and then turning it into a set of signals and dispatches and commands and so on that theoretically, if we shut down, somebody else could pick up. Now, obviously there's a lot of our IP built in around how we did that. Right. And also we're not building it to be some sort of closed door islanded standard. What we're doing is we're building it so that eventually when you plug into the non-existent DERMs at the utilities, because they all tell you they have DERMs and none of them do yet in full-fledged ways.
So can you define DERMs for someone who maybe isn't quite
Yeah, totally. It's a terrible acronym because it sounds like a bad skin disease.
Yep.
It's a distributed energy resource management system. And there are so many different flavors and varietals. One would think that you're looking at the 20,000 different types of bananas out there. It's basically supposed to be a system that can manage and orchestrate and at the very least understand what's happening with different types of DERs. What I would say is that at least the way we are helping our partners get to that future is that we're saying there are a set of grid standards that you need to move your vehicles to be able to communicate with and then respond to. Now, how you get them there, what is that API and so on and so forth, that work is obviously being done by WeaveGrid, and that is obviously something that is our advantage to be building that in there. But we are trying to move them to grid standards. Right. And vice versa with utilities, there isn't a set of standards per se that every DER can into, but we are also saying to them, look, if we can define the set of use cases, if we can say that this is the response rate that you need these resources to react to, et cetera, but every vehicle, every device, everything is not going to be built the same. I can tell you for a fact that a Tesla can behave very differently than a RAV4 Prime is going to respond very differently than a Kia EV9. A Kia EV9 can be bidirectional. A RAV4 Prime is not yet. So there's all these differences, right? That I hate to say it, but no Bluetooth standard is going to fix.
Yep.
And I just don't think that people are building that way, because remember, car companies are building it to be a car. They're not building it to be a grid asset. And so we are trying to help them make that possible.
Yeah.
What happens in the future if everything shuts down? That's the truth of it. That's the problem right now, is that our industry is challenged in the fact that we've got intersection between so many different industries happening right now. I can tell you for a fact that thermostats are not being built with any kind of grid standard. I can tell you for a fact that batteries are not being built with any kind of grid standard. So how do we move all of these devices towards a world where they can provide at least certain defined services? That's the kind of thing that utilities can help set out and be clear about. But again, like, every utility needs different things.
Yeah. I think there's also an arc. I mean, I like studying history on this too. I mean, you can talk about the grid as an example. You go back in time and there was not standards for voltage transmission or frequency or the debate between AC and DC transmission. So like it takes time for people to understand the value of a thing, and then for people to standardize on the set of values, and then for a standard to emerge to make it easier to scale. And I can appreciate that perhaps right now with the set of things that you're working on are really trying to enable the first wave of scale in the system to say, oh no, this is actually valuable enough that we would want to create an eventual Bluetooth, which was not the first way that wireless data ever moved, but it emerged after 17 things were tried and a couple things started to work.
And I also think that this is my biggest risk that I see with people trying to create standards too quickly in data standards in particular and so forth, which is that everything is changing so fast on the hardware, and we have not yet built up trust enough in the value that these things can do. Right. So to give you two examples of the enshittification that I'm worried about, it's one that there are too many people out there scraping too many APIs from vehicles and so forth that essentially lead to extremely poor service quality. AKA, you try telling a car what to do, and because the car locks you out because it basically thinks you're DDoSing it, it essentially doesn't get managed, which means now the utility says, I can't trust this thing. Right. It is not trustworthy, so I won't do it. The other problem I have in the enshittification world is when people from very different markets, let's say Europe or the UK, say, hey, in Europe and the UK, telling customers to charge in these ways or telling customers to move their heat pumps in these ways is super easy. And it's super easy because you're a retailer where all you need to do is essentially move people to a different time of use rate or whatever, but you actually don't care about the operational impacts on transformers or feeders or the transmission grid. Because that's not your problem. That's not your incentive. All you care about is balancing one book with the other book. And that's just a supply and demand problem on paper, not in the real world.
Right.
And so that's another enshittification, which is that because we believe that these devices create enough value in places where there is something like retail energy, we forget that they also create cost on the real world. If we don't look at those two things in the end-to-end framework, which is one, are we doing it in a cyber secure, in a customer friendly, in an actually high performance kind of way, not to mention legality and so forth of scraping people's APIs, and we're not looking at the end-to-end value chain, I think you run the risk of basically half-assing it, not creating enough value, and then stopping short and poisoning the well. Fundamentally, like I've got prospective customers whose well has been poisoned so hard, they don't trust DERs.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them. They came from a low trust place, and then you shoved a pretty mediocre solution in front of them and said, no, it works. And then it didn't. And so now the trust is even lower. You know, when I think about a lot of challenges in our climate sphere in general, we're trying to build trust with people who don't have a lot of trust in these new solutions because it just works today.
Yeah.
Why would I change the status quo when it just works? And this comes back a little bit to my rant against the term climate tech. I think too often we've talked about tech that helps with climate, but like the truth of the matter is we've got technology that has to help the whole economy decarbonize. It's like saying, hey, why don't we call everything in the economy that touches digital technologies economy tech? It's like, no, we have to help the whole economy decarbonize. So every different sphere, whether it's cement, whether it's the grid, whether it's whatever that has some form of technology embedded, can't just be called climate tech. Right. Because what it does is it diminishes the other value that that technology has to deliver. Clean, reliable, affordable electricity, actually cement that works when you're building buildings. All of those other value streams, quote unquote, get diminished if the only thing you're focusing on is the quote unquote climate part of it.
So what is your terminology solution there? Is it just to like take climate motivation and inject into whatever sector you're working in, and you view it as you work on energy tech, and like, so be it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't try to bucket it. I'm not an investor or I'm a former consultant, former investor. I don't have to bucket things anymore. Yeah. I just have to focus on my thing. But I think investors have to do it because they have to somehow justify a thesis that makes sense with the same IRR expectations that they did with mobile. And it's, if mobile could give me 40% IRR if I was interested in 2009, then I have to find climate tech to give me the same IRR. And that's not what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the opposite. Climate is not an enabling technology like mobile that's a new platform that's going to enable a bunch of new things. It is a non-engineered thing that we're dealing with in response to. So there's a bunch of ways in which that's factor to go chase, but it's not enabling the same way as a category.
That's my take. Yeah.
I agree. You also mentioned you don't love the term VPPs. Yet some would argue, some might say you're a VPP company, and your mentor, Jigar, I think, is generally a fan of VPPs. So for those listening, VPPs generally stands for virtual power plants. This idea that you can digitally control a bunch of devices, including certainly car batteries and thermostats, all this stuff to shift load in ways that make it look like a power plant to the grid. Why is that term not a good one for what you're trying to do?
I think there are a lot of terms that struggle to encapsulate the full value. Well, there's a negative here, which is like the term virtual power plant. It makes it equivalent to the fact that it's a power plant. Okay. Power plants are a very unique, specific thing. And I will say, like, we definitely can do things that could be aggregated up to look and feel like a power plant. And we absolutely do. Yes. Are we a VPP company? Absolutely. Are we a company that, as the definition of VPP goes, were mentioned in the VPP liftoff report? Absolutely. Are we capable of delivering the services that VPPs over the last decade have been able to provide? Absolutely. And we do it every day. Here's where we miss the plot. Back to, again, some of this enshittification point. There's so much more we can do.
Yep.
And there's so much that other VPPs cannot do. And when I get bucketed in with other types of resources that don't have the ability to perform at the level that we do. For example, they cannot manage transformers. They cannot manage a feeder level loading. They cannot do all of those other things that live outside of the power plants arena, because power plants don't do any of that. It diminishes my value. Now all I'm being compared to is, can you shift around energy equivalent to a natural gas power plant? Whereas that's honestly not the highest value thing we can do.
Right.
And I also think that the virtual power plant term has been around for a very long time. I have a training manual from 2014 that I remember looking at a few months ago that talked about VPPs in exactly the same way as it is today. What I keep asking myself is, like, what's changed fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
One, AI load growth means that suddenly we need to care a lot more than ever before. Between AI load growth and electrification load growth, we need to care a lot more about load management. So that's exciting. Good. The other thing that's changed is, there's no doubt IoT and communications have gotten a lot better. But again, when we abstract away all of this into only the software piece and we say, we can become a VPP company, you can become a VPP company, everyone can become a VPP company, because all we do is we aggregate a bunch of resources. We forget that, like, we're not even sure what value stream we're targeting. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the VPP reports talk about 12 different types of VPPs means that we don't actually know what a VPP is. We're trying too hard to bucket everything into a singular category. And I'll tell you, even power plants have extremely different services that they provide, right, and have very different kinds of power plants. So I think we're trying too hard again to shove all of the digital innovation that's happening into a singular framework so that it becomes easier for maybe an ultimate customer like a utility or for investors to understand it. Whereas the reality is that these are much more complex systems. And I'm not saying I have a perfect term. And this is infinitely frustrating to friends who are like, what's your equivalent term? But all I'm saying is, like, there's a need for increasing amounts of demand flexibility. Different products and different services will provide it. Let's talk about how we get there, how we create the most value, and how we build that trust. And I don't think the term VPP has engendered trust yet.
Yeah, it's better to describe what it is that you're in fact doing, which is, hey, there's these amazingly sized batteries on wheels that we're trying to deliver all over to people's houses. Shouldn't we be smart about how we use those? And that's what we're solving for. And isn't that going to be useful to the people generating and distributing electricity and their neighbors? And Yes.
And I know in this world today where we want everything distilled down to 140 characters, and I was a
280.
Very guilty, now 280, yeah. But as a very guilty user offset platform, get it. I really get it. I know we want to simplify things. But I do think that's part of what we have to learn to do as climate innovators. I don't think as users of products, that's what we have to do. There, you have to make it simple.
I mean, what you're selling to the end consumer is you can drive further with less cost.
Yeah. To end consumers, we're basically saying, we're going to help you automate your charging and it's going to be cheaper. That's what we're helping you with. You can plug in to get savings. That's really it.
I wanted to talk about the fact that I think WeaveGrid really exemplifies a software-centered company orchestrating real things in the world. But I presume a lot of your team is software engineers. And I, a couple of years ago, when I got started in climate, really reacted to a lot of software engineers and product designers and product people saying that there's no real software problems in climate. And I'm just curious what your take is and how you think about it is the team that you're building and what you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we're absolutely very welcoming to software engineers, which is the bulk of our team for sure, a very heavy software team. I think unlike probably a lot of other software businesses, you have to have that appreciation for the metal. You have to have that appreciation for systems being clunky on the other end. I think the amount of SFTP servers we have, it's a ton of that. You just cannot change the reality of what's out there. But, we also have a stack that uses Kubernetes. We're very much trying to be as modern as possible in our own systems while at the same time dealing with antiquated, outdated systems that are going through their own evolution.
Perfect for fintech people to come to you, right?
Perfect for fintech people. I love fintech people. I think if you're excited by that, right? If you're excited by the opportunity to use software to drive change in the physical world, companies like WeaveGrid are just super exciting. I think one of the places where software has struggled is when, again, they said, hey, the full business is going to live completely away from the real world. And all we need to do is think about the accounting and the reporting and all of that. And that in and of itself is all of the value. And I think we're going to struggle there because that's just very few people want that. People want to know that the work they're doing is driving impact in the real world. So you have to connect back to the real world. Or you need to have access to proprietary data that comes from the real world.
Right. The data integration alone is usually at least one way in which you need to touch the metal, even if it's, carbon removal, the MRV stuff. You eventually have to figure out what's actually happening in the real world. Otherwise, the better software company is probably a horizontal one that's Excel or something, right? If you're not specific to solving a vertical problem in some way.
That attracts a certain kind of engineer. I don't think every engineer is ready for that challenge, which is fine by me and it's fine by us. And we've been incredibly fortunate to hire just superstars, people who can go work anywhere, frankly, but want to really work on that climate impact and see, and I think have vetted the whole sphere of software companies in this space and said, we love the fact that what you're doing actually moves the needle.
Right.
That's a really exciting place to be. So yeah, look, we're literally in the midst of hiring a new head of our engineering team. And I think all the candidates who've come so far have been super excited about the idea that their work gets to interface with the real world. And I think we're going to see a lot of that innovation continue right now. I think we're also having a moment where people are re-recognizing, especially with, I think, GPUs and how GPU orchestration leads to better AI and how better AI can lead to better applications and so forth. We're having almost a re-emergence of the moment of the hardware and software interface. It's exciting to me as well, given where we sit.
On that note, what is the best way for someone to follow along you, your work, WeaveGrid? And it sounds like you're hiring. Any big calls to action for a listener?
Calls to action. If you're in a place where we have a WeaveGrid program, check your local utility out, sign up. That's one thing. If you are not and you're interested in WeaveGrid, follow us along on LinkedIn or X, I guess. Or do we have an Instagram? We might have an Instagram. I don't actually
TikTok?
know. Probably do, yeah. But yeah, you can always reach out to me as well. My email is just apoorv@weavegrid.com. And I can't promise I'll respond immediately, but I'll try. Or I'll forward you on to the right person. But yeah, really love hearing from folks who are interested in this space.
I'll link to all of that in show notes so people have quick and easy links. Apoorv, thank you for doing this. Thanks for being open about the journey and everything and building a truly impactful company using software.
I really appreciate it, Ben. Thanks for having me on. This was such a pleasure. It was fun to be able to talk about a bunch of things from life to the company.
Well, that's a wrap on today's episode of Climate Papa. I'm struck by Apoorv's relentless systems thinking, constantly pushing past the easy buzzwords to focus on the messy real-world mechanics of the energy transition. He has this rare clarity on how the biggest global challenges connect directly to the unglamorous technical work of building a better future. Thanks for coming on. As always, I welcome feedback and thoughts anytime to ben@climatepapa.com. And all right, with that, as always, let's have the Balkan Bump remix of Mellow Kind of Hype by Slink and Lazy Syrup Orchestra to take us out.
On we go like